Morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us for the Education Transformation 2020 presentation. Today's presentation is Strategies for Cultural Inclusion in Online and Face-to-Face Classrooms. My name is Victoria Kelly, and I'm on the training and support team here at Hawks Learning. And our speaker today is Professor Nathan McQueen of William Jessup University. Professor McQueen has taught English composition at a variety of universities in California and Hawaii, with incredibly diverse cultural student populations since 2015. He has done humanitarian work in Cambodia, Haiti, and Mexico, and worked in juvenile halls. He holds a master's and bachelor's in English from CSU Sacramento, and his writing has appeared in issues of the North American Review, Fiction Southeast, Entropy, The Greek Diaries, Thomas, Nature of the West, Stereo Stories, and others. We're so excited that Professor McQueen is here to share his experience and insight with us today. We do have a large audience, and we're going to try to do our best to get to as many questions as possible today. My colleague Julia is here to help us. She is a training and support specialist as well. We work together on the same team here at Hawks, and she's joining us in the background of the webinar today. She's going to be here to help answer questions throughout the webinar, so please enter those into the question and answer box as we go, and we'll be here to write back to you. And if you have any questions specifically for Professor McQueen, we'll save those for the end of the presentation, and we'll have about 5 to 10 minutes of question and answer time. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our presenter. The floor is yours, Professor McQueen.
Thank you. All right, well, welcome everybody. It is very hot over here in Sacramento, California, where I'm from. It's been like 110 degrees, so, and it's, yeah. So some of you are probably in other parts of the country that might not be as awful as it is over here, but we're glad she could join us today. And I wish I could see your faces, but I can't see them. So, but I know that we have a lot of people joining in, so it's really great that so many people are interested in this topic that I'm going to talk about today and kind of share my experience. So we'll jump in and get started. And like Victoria said, we're going to have a question and answer at the end, and I'll also be giving you some resources that hopefully will be helpful to you as you jump into your classrooms into a very unique fall 2020, whether it's face-to-face, online, or hybrid classes that you'll be jumping into teaching. All right, so we're talking about strategies for cultural inclusion for the classroom. And let me get going here. There we go. So this is what we're going to talk about today. First I'm going to talk about myself a little bit, though I don't really like to, but I'm going to talk about myself and who I am, so you get to know me a little bit. I want to talk about the importance of cultural inclusion and understanding. And I also want to go briefly into diversity pedagogy theory. We'll talk about that a little bit, just as kind of a more theoretical framework when it comes to, you know, us as educators and understanding how we can understand and utilize diversity in our classrooms and really help our students out. Really yet. I mean, I teach college, but this could be for, you know, K through 12 as well. And then we'll jump right into some strategies for cultural inclusion that I've utilized over the last 5 or so years. And I'll talk about that a little more in depth, give some personal examples of the triumphs and the failures. And sadly, you learn a lot more from the failures than you do from the triumphs, but we'll talk about those as well. So this is a little bit about me. There was a little bit of a bio beforehand that talked about, you know, things that I've, you know, where I've taught and where I went to school and publications and things like that. So I wanted to talk about things that were not mentioned in there, so you get to know me. But yeah, right now I teach part-time at a lot of different universities in the Sacramento area. I've also taught in Hawaii on the Big Island for Hawaii Community College. So I have, and being in Sacramento, it's one of the third most diverse cities in the United States. So, and I teach a lot of different schools there, and each school has its own kind of demographics. So it's been a very interesting and actually pretty fun experience teaching over here. So some other stuff that was mentioned, I had done humanitarian work in Mexico, Haiti, and Cambodia. We helped do health education and build homes, painted buildings, and did a lot of different things to try to help communities. Taught English at one of the English language schools for one of the communities in Battambang, Cambodia. So yeah, I think traveling and really experiencing other cultures will actually be one of the most beneficial things that you could do to incorporate cultural inclusion into your classrooms when you really are immersed and not just going somewhere on vacation, but actually like jumping in, being like, hey, I'm going to be here for 2 months, or I'm going to be here for a month. And I'm really going to see how these people live. I'm going to see how these people, what they think, what type of culture they are. Are they very, these are all different things that you really can see when you go into these other cultures. I've been married for 16 years and I have 3 daughters. One's 12, another is going to be 10 next week, and then one is 6 and heading into the preteen years. So any help would be helpful. I just need help. But anyway, and then the last little tidbit of information is that I went to preschool with the Green Bay quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, who you may or may not have known if you're a football fan or not. He's a pretty good football player, and he may have taken one of my dinosaur toys as a kid. I don't know for sure, but I may have to try to get a hold of him and tell him he owes me a brontosaurus. But yeah, that's a funny little tidbit that I like to tell people. What's annoying though is I have like my picture of our class, but I was sick that day, so I can't actually prove that I was in there. Though my mom is in that picture, but I wasn't in the picture, so it's hard for me to prove. But I swear, he went to my birthday party. I would go to his house. We'd play dinosaurs all the time. Anyway, a little bit about me. This is my website up there that just has some of my writing and things like that, since I enjoy writing. But if you want to check it out, you're free to do that later or do other things. All right. So again, talking about my experience, so you can see where I'm coming from. These are all the schools I've taught at in, except for one. These are all schools that I've taught at the last 5 years. As you can see, I'm at William Jessup University, which is a Christian liberal arts college. And then American River College, Folsom Lake College, and Cosumnes River College are all part of the Los Rios district in California, in the Sacramento area. Hawaii Community College is on there, and Woodland. And if you look at this chart, what you see is that each school that I teach at or have taught at has very different, cultural demographics behind it, right? If we look at William Jessup, it's a private school, higher tuition, also a Christian liberal arts. So we have mostly a white population, usually white upper class. So that presents a different perspective when it comes to cultural inclusion, which I'll share an example of that later on when I talk about strategies. But that's something that's very eye-opening for me. American River College is extremely diverse. I mean, you have 44% white, but you also have a large Hispanic population, good amount of Asian, and actually the Middle Eastern population is very high there. And I encounter a lot of Iraqi, Iranian, Syrian, Turkish, I mean, you name it. The whole Middle Eastern area is very well represented at American River College, and I deal with a lot of them in my classes and on a one-on-one basis and stuff. And they're very wonderful people, but it's a population is very strong there. At Hawaii Community College, it's an island, right? And it's a Polynesian island. So you have a lot of Asian, and you have the other, which is Native Hawaiian, and that makes up the majority of it. But it also makes up with the Polynesian, there's also Micronesian from the Marshall Islands. You have a lot of Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Southeast Asian. There's a lot of those types of demographics there as well. So that was very unique to go there. And it's also an island, so there's that island vibe, you know. We got a lot of just a lot of aloha. So it was I really loved teaching there. It was really great. And the University of Hawaii Hilo, which is part of the system, is considered the most diverse university in the United States. So, so again, yeah, high levels of diversity and mixed races. It's very interesting to work there. Woodland Community College, as you'll see, is predominantly Hispanic. It's an agricultural area here in the Sacramento Valley. So there is a lot of immigrant and undocumented Hispanics that come over and work there. And almost all my classes are probably 80 to 90% Hispanic of 30 students. I'm married to a woman who's half Mexican, half Spanish. So I'm more comfortable in that culture. And I grew up in a farming area, so I kind of understand that, though my Spanish is not very good. But yeah, and so if you kind of look through this, Folsom Lake, more predominantly white. You also have Exumas River College has a pretty good mix of white, black, Latino, Asian. There's a pretty good mix of cultures down in Exumas, which is in the southern Sac area. So every school presents different opportunities and different different experiences that I've encountered when working with different groups and trying to understand how I can best reach out to them, encourage them, and teach them, really, because each culture has its different perceptions and ways of learning. So that's a little bit about me and my experience. So you can see that I've worked with a lot of diverse groups, and a lot of different, and that's just culturally. I mean, within those cultures are different, religious beliefs and things like that. So it's been very rewarding and challenging at times, but very rewarding. All right. So why does this matter? We got all these cultures, we got the melting pot, we have all that stuff. Why is that even, it's like, that's great, but why, right? So I want to talk about why this matters, especially as educators. And one, it's going to help us as instructors understand the cultural factors that influence student learning and performance. Each culture has a very different perspective on education and have different pressures that are on them, different life experiences. And if we understand those as educators, then we can better encourage, support, give them resources, and understand how they're viewing the world. And by doing that, we're able to really succeed in doing our best. And your students will, if you take the time to do this, you definitely will, get a thank you at the end of the course, which I've experienced. Being culturally inclusive in the classroom also allows students a safe, inclusive space to talk freely about their life without judgment, or about their beliefs without judgment. As you know, the climate in the world is a little chaotic right now, especially in terms of politics and, religion and race and all of these things. And a lot of people are really angry. So you can't really have a discussion in some places, right? Especially the internet. It's a terrifying place. You don't want to have discussions on the internet. So where's the safest place that we can have this? I mean, ideally, it's in the classroom. It's in a place where we can hear each other's hearts, hear each other's beliefs, hear each other's experiences, and have a discussion about it instead of a shouting match or a screaming match or whatever, or just this sort of stuff, right? So having that safe space allows not only underrepresented groups to be able, or BIPOC people to be able to actually have a voice. It's also just a safe place for them, for all of us to kind of learn from each other and learn about each other. It's going to open our perspectives on the diversity of the human condition, right? A lot of times we live in little echo chambers. Theo Wilson had talked about, one of his TED Talks, had talked about how even online, though we have access to all of these cultures, we live in this it's like a little echo chamber. So we don't want to do that where we just have our same thoughts, echoed or regurgitated back at us. We want to be able to be in a world, be in a classroom, be in a church that actually allows us to open our minds and view other perspectives. And it also creates connections with your students. It helps that interpersonal aspect of being a teacher, right? Especially once they're out of your classroom, because when they're your student, it can be a little like, well, I'm not going to be too friendly with you, you're my student. But having those students come up to you afterward, you know, and when they see you later on campus or something, be like, oh yeah, I really liked that when we had that discussion about that, or when we watched that one film, or whatever it could be. You know, it's going to create a connection that hopefully will, you know, stand the test of time. So those are all reasons why cultural inclusion is really important in the classroom. Now we're going to get into some of the more studious stuff, but I want to just give you some resources to do and talk about diversity pedagogy theory just a little bit, and then you can do more research on this. As you can see, this is from Rosa Hernandez Sheets from her book, Diversity Pedagogy. And so the theory and the principle behind this type of theory is that it's to point out the natural and inseparable connection between culture and cognition. And that's really important, culture and cognition. In other words, we have to be able to understand, acknowledge the critical role culture plays in the teaching learning process. And so culturally inclusive teachers are going to do a couple things. They're going to observe children's cultural behavioral patterns to identify individual and group cultural competencies and skills, and to also use this knowledge to guide their teaching decisions. Understanding culture and then applying it to your teaching practices and teaching assessments and teaching activities and all of these different things. So that's really kind of the foundation that we're working on as we go into this culturally inclusive thing and looking at the strategies of it. This is a chart that's also part of her theory, of Hernandez Sheets' theory. And these are behaviors that teachers can take. And she talks about each one a little bit more in depth. I just kind of wanted to talk about, you know, some of these things: diversity, identity, social interaction, culturally safe classroom context, language, culturally inclusive context, instruction, assessment. Teachers have a lot to do. And if you are a teacher, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And it's a lot worse if you're a K through 12 teacher, because then you have all kinds of other things, and it just, it's a lot of work. But it's an important job. And so these are different things that we want to think about as we are, you know, engaging with our students. When it comes to diversity, we're referring to like the dissimilarities in traits, qualities, characteristics, beliefs, values, and mannerisms present in yourself and in others. Identity refers to the knowledge of who we are and what groups we belong to. Again, these are just brief synopsis, I guess, just one sentence synopsis of each one of these. She talks about these more in depth. Social interactions are public and shared contact or communication in group settings. Culturally safe classroom context is an environment where students feel emotionally secure, psychologically consistent, and culturally, linguistically, academically, socially, physically comfortable. Language is, you know, just human language. That's another factor of culture that is going to be very difficult to navigate sometimes, especially if you don't speak the language or understand how certain languages are set up. Those are things we have to take into consideration. Culturally inclusive content is the influence, substance, meanings, and perspectives present in the instructional resources used in the various fields of study, such as literacy, mathematics, science, social studies. Instruction, your teaching actions, you know, thinking about what you're going to do in order to best suit them. Some groups, it's going to work well. Other groups, it's going to take a nosedive. And that's part of the learning process. And assessment, also thinking about your assessments and how you actually are going to assess whether they're learning the information or not. Thinking of culturally inclusive assessments. And for me, it's easy because if I'm an English teacher, I can do a narrative essay. Tell me about an experience, you know, tell me about a cultural tradition that your family has. That's really easy for me. If you're teaching mathematics or you're teaching, you know, science or something like that, it can be a little trickier, but there are ways to go about that. All right, so talked about the pedagogy theory. Some of you probably went, oh, good, no more theory. That's great. All right, so now we're jumping into the actual strategies that I use when it comes to being culturally inclusive. All right, and I'll talk about each one of these as we go through it, but we're going to talk about 4 strategies. First one is to create an open environment, right? Kind of what was mentioned before was that culturally safe classroom context. That's what we want to do. We want to have a safe place for students to be able to talk about their lives, their beliefs, what it is they are going through. All right. So in face-to-face classrooms, it's a little easier. You can set the tone for the course. And by setting the tone, meaning openly talking about our cultural differences, not in a judgmental way, but in being interest. We're talking about your own cultural background, talking about your own cultural traditions you may have, and another important aspect of that is to allow students to share faith, beliefs, and experiences, either as a class or in groups. Allow them to share that without judgment, without saying anything. And if they're able to share, other people may be like, oh yeah, we do that too over in our house, or oh, we do something similar, then, and that allows for communication among people of different cultures and backgrounds and ethnic beliefs and religious beliefs, sexual orientation. It can be very, as long as you are there to kind of moderate and set it up. All right. You can't just say like, talk about this, I'm going to go to the bathroom. You got to sit there and engage with them and establish that tone. Class and group discussions are great, and you can assign students to specific groups. As you get to know your students, especially in a college classroom, maybe by the 2nd, 3rd day, you kind of get to know them. You can assign them, right? And just start to see how those group discussions go. And sometimes personality plays a factor into that, but that's something that you want to think about. Online classes, you're not up there and you can't really set the tone that well. So something that I usually do is create an intro forum, like in a discussion forum, where I use directed questions. It could be, what is your family heritage? What countries have you visited? Do you have any cultural traditions that you do in your family for holidays? And as they start to share, other students can chime in, you can chime in, you can comment, and it just gets the ball rolling, So those are ways that you can kind of do that online to create that open and safe environment. All right. Now the second part, and this one is actually one of the more important ones, especially to really create that safe environment, is to talk with your students. You can interact with them in the intro forum or online course. And the key here is to be friendly, but not a friend. You have to kind of draw that line. I've had students before that have read on my evals, he just wants to be your friend. That's all he wants. He just is, he's not studious, and he's not, doesn't look like a professor that you're supposed to see. That person still got like a C or a D, but for some reason they thought I wanted to be their friend. So you got to kind of draw the line. You can't be you want to be friendly and talk with them, but you can't be, buddy with them and stuff. Still have that distance, but just talking with them. And some talking points can be their families, interests, food, heritage, music, traditions. And that's why I have falafels right here, because whenever I get another student, that whether they're Middle Eastern, African, Mexican, Cambodian, you name it, you start talking about food from their culture. And I've had students that want me to come over to their house so they can make me a delicious Afghani meal, and I'm like, that sounds great. It's a little weird, but bring it to me. That'd be great. So food is a great segue into understanding cultures and creating trust with your students. So I highly recommend doing that. All right. Okay, now here's the other fun thing as a teacher, is doing a little bit of research to learn about your students. Now you've learned about them in an informal way and stuff, and you might learn about, hey, their background is they're Basque from the Basque country, or they're Haitian, maybe, they're Haitian, Nigerian, Colombian, Russian, Georgian, Ukrainian. And what you want to do is, because you have the internet, you can actually learn about those cultures a little bit more. And these are some questions that I wrote to kind of think about. Is there a majority of a certain culture in your class? Like Woodland, I have a lot of Hispanic students. So it's predominantly Hispanic culture. What do I need to learn about that culture in terms of their of how they view education, what the overall belief system is, what are the pressures that they face outside of the classroom, what are their socioeconomic backgrounds. Those are all questions that are embedded in here that are very important to understand. What types of assessments and texts can I assign that are going to be most interesting and effective and engage them? Also, understanding the history of these cultural groups. It's usually a pretty easy Google search, and you can figure out, oh, Armenians really don't like the Turks. Well, why? Oh, because of the Armenian genocide. Haitians and Dominican Republic residents really don't like each other, and there was the Parsley Massacre that occurred with that. Cambodian French, they don't get along. Cambodian Thai, they don't get along. So there's a lot of different historical aspects that you can kind of understand to see like where this culture is kind of coming from. How do these cultures view education is very important. And are they a cold climate or warm climate culture? Now, that's kind of a whole nother aspect of cultures, but cold climate tends to be more efficiency based, while warm climate cultures tend to be more event based. Warm climate tend to be more event based, so they're not punctual like cold climate people might be. So if you think of like the United States and you think of Canada, and usually like more predominantly white cultures, they're very punctual, they're efficient, and they have high emphasis on education and things like that. And they tend to be more individualistic. Now, warm climate cultures are more collectivist. You do stuff for the better of the group. It's more event-based. So if you say, I'm going to be there, it's going to start at 5, and they get there at 5:30, well, they got ready at 5, and they're making their way there. So they're not as punctual in the terms of cold climate culture. So those are aspects that are different. And again, a good Google search will kind of help you understand those two different approaches to living, essentially. And just for time's sake, we got our last strategy, and this is probably one of the most effective means to be inclusive and promote discussion, because you can kind of try to do it on your own, but it's going to be much more helpful if you get the help from people that are really good storytellers or really good writers or really good filmmakers. And that's choosing diverse texts. Texts meaning curriculum, film, essays, artwork, things like that. And it's going to bring attention to different issues and context within certain cultures. So, and it's also going to help students from those cultures feel included and feel like they have a voice. And so I have here, I'll talk about some texts, and I'll be giving you a resource of texts that I have used that I think are very helpful. All right. And so like I have Bless Mi Ultima by Rodolfo Anaya, a great piece of Mexican literature or Chicano literature. Lone Ranger and Tano Fist Fight in Heaven by Sherman Alexie really illuminates the plight of Native Americans, yet does it in kind of a humorous way. And then very popular one is Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. That's a very powerful book about being a Black man in the United States. Again, other texts that I've used, The Devil's Highway talks about the stretch of land, I think it's between Texas and Mexico, kind of going into New Mexico, where a lot of coyotes take immigrants over and a lot of them die. And this talks about a specific group and just talks about border relations. It's a very good book. Earth and Ashes is Atiq Rahimi's, it's a novel by an Afghan writer. Caucasia deals with two sisters that are of mixed race. One is white, one is black, and their two experiences. That's a very good book as well. First They Killed My Father. You may have heard of that one from the Netflix movie. That's a memoir about the Cambodian genocide. Very powerful book. Really helped me when I went to Cambodia to really understand what that country had gone through. There's films as well. You have A Better Life. It's about an illegal father trying to provide for his son. Very good film. The 13th, another great book, kind of bits based off of The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Real Engines, it's about Native American Indian portrayal in Hollywood. And then the same with The Slanted Screen. It's the Asian men in film and television. And these are all very good starting points. for discussions, especially, and being culturally inclusive and things like that. There's also some TED Talks, The Muslim on the Airplane by Amal Qasir. And these are YouTube searches that you can do. Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Black Men Undercover in the Alt-Right by Theo Wilson. And I'm Not a Stereotype, I'm That Jew, Aitan Chitayat. These are all very good that discuss stereotypes, the importance of discussion. Yeah, each one of these I find very helpful. So, and they are included in the resource list. All right. So that is pretty much what I've got. Failed to talk about some specific examples and stories, but if you have questions or ideas or thoughts or want to hear about the times I failed trying to do being culturally inclusive, you can send me an email at mmcqueen@jessup.edu. So thanks for joining us, and hopefully this will help you as you start in your classroom soon. Mahalos.
Thank you so much, Professor McQueen. We do have some kind comments in the chat. We've had many thanking you for your presentation and kind comments. We do have a question right now, and from Gregory Steinbach. How do you suggest ways to be inclusive in curriculum for a mathematics curriculum?
Oh, yes, I ran out of time, but I did want to mention that because I know that we have a lot of people here that are not in the, English, philosophy, literature, those types of disciplines. Now, I was trying to think of this because me and math have a very antagonistic relationship. So I'm like, well, how would you do that? And actually, it was my wife. She had like, well, I think part of what you could do is because, math knows no race. It's just math, right? So something that you could do is actually provide maybe a brief, lesson on some prominent mathematicians or statisticians, whatever it is you're really talking about in terms of math, of like prominent African-American mathematicians that contributed to society, or Hispanic American, Asian American, whatever, culture you really want to look at. And it's not teaching math, so to speak, but more like math history and math contributions and stuff like that. Just like if you're in science, if there's any science teachers out there, good for you. But, you think about someone like George Washington Carver. I haven't seen this movie, but I know about Hidden Figures, the film with the African-American women that helped in the NASA space program. And those are all, people that contributed greatly to those fields that are of diverse backgrounds and things like that. So that's an approach that you could do. And that's my best guess. You could talk with other math or science professors that might be trying to incorporate that. I think that could be helpful. But that's my best guess from a math illiterate person.
Thank you. We have another comment. This instructor says, I've had trouble teaching Alexi. It seems to anger some people. Any ideas to help?
We've had the same experience, haven't we? Yeah, so I love Alexi because I guess I have a darker sense of humor, but it does, especially when you're teaching like comp classes that are for more of a general audience and not necessarily English students, you get some very varied reactions and they do get kind of upset and stuff like that. So again, the nice thing with the Lone Ranger and Tonto is it is a bunch of short stories. So I usually don't teach the whole book. I will pick out a few that are most accessible because sometimes he gets a little poetic and can drift off. So that's why Lone Ranger and Tonto is probably one of the better ones to teach. And again, I think maybe with Alexi, it might be helpful to provide additional resources to go along with Alexi. I found that if you just give people, say, here, this is a book about Native Americans, read it, and this is Alexi, read it. And they read it and they're like, this guy just pisses me off. I don't like this guy. But if you give them a cultural, historical context, you know, and it could be, I remember I taught this, and I taught Lexi, and then we watched I think it was like a Vice News 20-minute documentary on the Lakota Reservation up in Wyoming, which is the poorest reservation in the United States, and the alcoholism and drug abuse and domestic violence that occurs there. And when the students saw that, then they really saw reservation life, and they were like, oh man, yeah, that I can see where his kind of despondency and hopelessness comes from, and even his kind of sardonic humor, and how they would think, you know, oh, he's just another drunk Indian type of comments that he makes in the book, how those, you know, how he could say something like that. And I think if people don't have that context, they're just going to think he's being crass or rude or something like that. So that would be my suggestion, is to kind of give some ancillary support to Alexi prior to assigning it, or it synonymously with it. I think it would probably be more helpful. That was my experience anyway. But I still have people that just hate Alexi, and they get pissed off at me for assigning it and just complain. But that's just, they're students, they complain. That's what they do.
Will asked if you could repeat the name of the Vice documentary.
Oh, the name? A lot of these are just YouTube searches. I think if you typed in like a Lakota Reservation, it might be one of the top ones that will come up. I can do a search for it and maybe give it to you on the resource list. But honestly, most of my stuff comes from just YouTube. So if you talk about, you just type in Lakota Reservation, it probably will be one of the first ones that come up. And it is very powerful. I mean, that reservation is completely decimated. Let me see, Lakota Reservation or Lakota Reservation Life. Oh, let me see here. I think I just found it on my first little search here. Oh, it's like a 2-part thing. Yeah, that was one part. But yeah, I don't have the actual name of it, but honestly, just look Lakota Res, and that will be the first thing it'll be one of the top ones that come up, and you'll find some really good and helpful ones. Vice also does another one that talks about immigration, and goes through a specific story of a Guatemalan guy that came over and then was deported back to Guatemala away from his family and things like that. So that's a good one that goes with like the Devil's Highway. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll take this last question here. Do you have any suggestions for how to address some of the issues that we're facing today, such as Black Lives Matter, the mask controversy, the U.S. Postal Service, fake news? Anything you'd like to share, discuss there?
Oh, man. Well, I guess in terms of the classroom we're talking about, yeah. I think in terms of the classroom, honestly, one of the most effective things is to talk about it, and to talk about it objectively. I remember having one class, and this was a couple years ago, and it was one of the most diverse classes I ever had. I had a student from Japan, a student from Uganda, a student, I didn't remember what country he was from, but he was from the Middle East. There's about half African-American, Hispanic, white, you name it. I mean, I had everything in that class. I loved it. It was one of the funnest classes I ever taught. And we watched the 13th. We talked about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. We had discussions about race as a class. And honestly, the only people that get kind of weirded out or upset about it are other white students. They're the ones that get upset when we talk about race. And I had 2 or 3 of the students come up to me, the minority students come up to me afterward, and they said, I just want to thank you for talking about it, like just bringing it up. And it's like, one of them might have said, like, even if like you didn't understand exactly what was going on, you still brought it up and we talked about it. And I'm like, thanks, I think. You don't know what you're talking about, but we really appreciate that you talked about it. So just having an open discussion and kind of allowing students to talk about it. And I think objectively is the key. We, you know, especially with the political aspect of our current country, it's very divisive. So if we lean one way or the other and push that on students, they're going to be like, screw this guy. I'm not going to talk about this with them. He's just going to get mad. And I've heard a lot of students say that about other professors when they're talking with me, and like they say something that doesn't agree with the professor's views, and he rips them a new one. And I'm like, that is kind of the opposite of what we're trying to do here, you know? So I think that objectivity and actually talking about it is going to be really, really helpful. And I think that's probably my best suggestion of approaching it in the classroom, you know?
Thank you so much. So what I can see from our chat and our question and answer box, we've had a lot of wonderful feedback based on your presentation, and also just really great discussion. Some of these points that instructors have chatted in, I just wanted to bring to light to everybody who's listening in. So one instructor mentioned for math classes, you could consider how science and math are viewed in a couple of different cultural contexts, which I do believe we kind of discussed a little bit. And then for math majors and minors, Stanley says that the MAA has a book for free downloading. It's called Living Proof: Stories of Resilience Along the Mathematical Journey. And it also has numerous autobiographical essays. Mr. Grant also says the book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for Whites to Talk About Racism, is a good read with practical suggestions. Another instructor said, suggesting transparency about your values, but also keeping an open mind and climate. And then Dr. Hadel asked if you've ever heard of the text, How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents. Although it's fiction, it works well with a large Hispanic population. And the author is Julia Alvarez from the Dominican Republic. Have you heard of that text?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it though, but that'd probably be a good one to check out. I mean, Chicano literature is like blowing up right now, just with a lot of great voices coming out. And so it's really hard to keep up, you know, with all of these great writers coming out. One person I want to talk about had mentioned that with Alexi, it's complicated because of the sexual harassment issues that he had. And that's not just with Alexi, but you're probably gonna have other authors and things that's going to come out. And again, that's a tricky part too, because when that came out, I had issues. I'm like, well, do I want to teach this guy anymore? I don't know if I really want to teach Alexi if he's this type of dude. But again, that's kind of, I guess, a personal dilemma. I've had some of my favorite musicians recently got exposed for their, you know, sexual abuse and other fans and things like that. And it was really, I'm like, do I listen to this person anymore? And that's a whole nother moral dilemma, I guess. but yeah, it is complicated. But yeah, I love seeing in the comments here just people talking about, you know, sharing resources that they've found and suggestions and things. That's really great. And yeah, it's all about the discussion. If any of you do use a TED Talk, a great one is The Muslim on the Airplane by Amal Qasir. She's a Syrian poet, and she talks about the importance of conversation, because she says, whenever I'm on an airplane, I'm the elephant in the room, because she has her, you know, headscarf, and she's a Muslim. And so she's always the elephant in the room. That's why she's the elephant on the airplane, you know? And she's like, you know, if people would just have discussions instead of assigning names and identities to people and having these having a conversation, they'd find they have more in common than they do differences. You know, I mean, I was on a plane one time, and I sat next to this Iranian guy who actually ended up not living that far away from me in Sacramento. But, you know, we sat there, we had a conversation for 45 minutes on the way from LA to Sacramento about religion, you know, because I'm Christian and he's a Muslim. And so we're talking and we had, it was, you know, you see, you would assume based on media representations of a Muslim guy, you know, being resistant to talk about another religion, and he would just be angry and he would not want to talk with me and be upset. And we had a great discussion. It was just wonderful, very open-minded, talking with each other. And it was very great, but it all stems from a conversation, having that discussion. And so, I would recommend Amal Kassir's Muslim on the Airplane. It's very good. But I love seeing everybody talking and giving suggestions to each other and supporting each other here. I've heard of white fragility yet, and it's very true. Oh, one other experience. I want to talk about one failure if we have time, because I wanted to talk about a failure I had, and this was at William Jessup University. And this is the importance of understanding doing that research that I talked about, number 3, doing the research. Because I knew going in that most of my students were white evangelical Christians or of some kind, right? Christians, upper class, and things like that. Had a few minorities, and they were on the sports teams usually. And within my courses, I decided I'm going to do a culturally inclusive curriculum. We're going to talk about different experiences. We're going to talk about the African-American experience for a couple of weeks. We're going to talk and read literature and watch films. We're going to talk about, Mexican-American experience, Asian-American, Middle Eastern experience, gender. We're going to do all that stuff, right? By the middle of that semester, I wanted to quit. I had so much resistance and animosity, complaints, saying that I was pushing a liberal agenda and all of these crazy things. And we were just trying to talk about it. And my only allies was like the one African-American woman and the one Korean American were my only 2 allies in the courses that I taught. And I was so demoralized after that. And I went back and I thought, well, I just don't think I can do this. I think I have to be, that was too much, too fast, right? This group did not want to talk about that. A lot of them are pretty young. They're probably just living off of the ideals of that their parents had set for them, whether it was politically or religious or faith-based views. And so I had to be, so my next courses, I stuck in little things that we did that were culturally inclusive, right? We did watch the 13th, but I only had one complaint from one student saying I was too political. God forbid you talk about race in a classroom, you know, and the serious issues that are going on. But that's really important because I was completely ineffective in that regard. It was kind of like a punch in the face to them, and they were highly resistant, did not want to talk about it, and were very, very difficult. And so I had to understand, I can't do that. If it's a group of if it was like Woodland, where I have a lot of Hispanics, I can talk about race and they'll talk about it and want to talk about it, but not in certain groups. So you have to be very conscientious. I can't say that word right now, but you have to be very aware of who you're teaching and where they're coming from. So that's a very important teaching fail that I had, that I always pass on to people, because your good intentions can come back to bite you in the butt.
Thank you for your transparency. Yeah, good intentions for sure, but yeah, thank you for sharing that experience. This has been such great discussion, and I know I personally enjoyed it. I've seen chats come in that this has been really insightful and refreshing discussion. We did have one more question, if you don't mind, pop in. So I thought maybe this could be our last question, since we're running close to out of time. But Anna Boyle asks, how would you address Alexi's personal issues with your students?
Oh, the sexual harassment issues and stuff? Oh boy.
I believe that's likely.
Yeah, his personal issues, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Man, I don't know. I mean, that's not necessarily like a culturally inclusive discussion, but I think that it has to do with more, that's more of a gender issue, I would have to say, which also is important to discuss. I try to include that in my courses regarding women as well. But yeah, I haven't really broached it because I don't know if I've taught Alexi since that came out. So it's a little different. But again, I think just having to kind of ask the students, it's like, well, we have this, author, and he has been accused of sexual harassment, and his response to it wasn't great. What do you guys think about this? Why do you think he would be this way? Is it just pride or ego? Is it something within his specific culture, like within the tribe? Certain cultures have, like, in Hispanic culture, you have machismo, right? And so, like, is that, which Dagoberto Gilb has he has a essay called "Mi Macho, You Jane," which talks about that within his essay. But yeah, I mean, honestly, can't really give you a great strategy for that. It's kind of an awkward conversation, but I think it would also be very helpful to hear from the women in the class what their thoughts are on that, and you never really know where the discussion is going to lead until you actually start it, whether they'll actually share, and maybe put them in groups to share. That might be better. Some people don't want to talk in front of a classroom, but if you put them into smaller groups, maybe that's a discussion that they can have just for them to kind of process and think about that sort of thing. Yeah. So yeah, it's a tricky subject when you got guys doing that. Messes up your curriculum. Who knows? Maybe it'll lead into something that's a little bit very productive and maybe even cathartic and healing for some people.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that's definitely a tough subject of conversation. I do think this is an interesting point. John Withers chatted and he said gender treatment can be a cultural inclusivity point, and noting Alexi and his faults provides his voice and his humanity. I think that's well, it looks like we're about out of time, and we so appreciate your presentation today, Professor McQueen. Thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone who have attended today. If you have any questions, please direct them to us at marketing@hawkeslearning.com. We'll also be emailing you a link to view this webinar on demand. Feel free to share it with your colleagues, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay well.
Thank you very much for joining me and letting me speak.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.